many of you have heard of a gentleman by the name of John Bradford? John Bradford. He was an English reformer. He was a preacher at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but that would have been in the 1500s, so quite some time ago. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for alleged crimes against Queen Mary I, and he was burned at the stake on the 1st of July 1555, some 450 years ago. Now you probably, unless you are well versed in church history, you may not know who John Bradford was. You may never have heard of the name before. But I can guarantee you've probably said something that he once said. I can just imagine that most of us at some time will have repeated something that he once said. John Bradford was watching criminals going to be executed at one point in his life. And when he was watching these criminals going to be executed, he used this phrase, which we have picked up today. He said, "There but for the grace of God go I. There but for the grace of God go I." Now we may well have said that phrase ourselves, or we may well have thought that phrase ourselves, and it usually comes along when something in life has gone horribly wrong for someone else. When something is not going right for somebody else. And we may say as we see them, "Oof, there but for the grace of God go I." Which means we feel fortunate that that's not our lot. That that's not our situation. We feel a sense of sympathy for them. So we use that phrase, "There but for the grace of God go I." But it's a phrase that we use, like so many phrases in life, that I'm not sure many people fully appreciate what it is they're actually saying. To truly understand what they mean by the grace of God. What do we mean by the grace of God? And I'm going to pose a question this morning, similar to maybe the one we looked at last time. And again, it's about the church. It's about those people who call themselves believers, about those people who say they are the called out of God. Last time I asked the question, what's the point of church? What is the point of church? And I'm sure we thought about the fact that a lot of people outside are thinking, what is the point of the church? What is the point of these people? And I suggested from the text that we were looking at that the fundamental purpose, the fundamental point of the church is to preach Christ and Him crucified. That is its main goal. If it's got nothing else to say, that should be at the forefront of its words. To preach Christ and Him crucified. To tell people about the mercy of God seen in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The mercy of God. Where we see how God withholds from us a judgment that we deserve. That's what we're looking at Calvary. A place that judgment for our sins is laid upon someone else. Is put upon someone else. And we did agree that alongside the preaching, the fundamental preaching of that, there is a place inside the church community for what you might call social activities, for the food banks, for the warm hubs, for those places where we can offer people respite from the problems that they might be facing in their lives, maybe financial or, as we say, food-wise. There is that place for it, but never at the expense of the truth. Never at the expense of the fundamental purpose that people need to know that Jesus Christ died for them. That is a fundamental thing for the church to hold on to. Our core teaching, as it were. That's what people need to hear. So we looked at that question in a lot of detail. What's the point of the church last time? Well, I'm going to throw another question out today. And the following question from that is this one. Does the church still believe in the grace of God? Does the church still believe in the grace of God? And if it does, is there evidence? Is there evidence to show that it still does? As I mentioned last time, we looked at the mercy of God. The mercy of God shown towards us at Calvary. But the grace of God is something different. The grace of God is something different. Someone once put it this way: mercy is the servant to grace's glory. Simply put, mercy is not getting what you do deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. And grace is getting what you don't deserve. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. And that's important to remember as we go through. And those two little phrases are important to remember as we think about the gospel, as you read the Bible, as you look into spiritual things. The mercy of God is getting what you do deserve. Is not getting what you do deserve. And the grace of God is getting what you don't deserve. Now, my wife recently bought a book. As Kylie will tell you, I'm not an avid reader. My friend Darsh is a huge reader of books. If you give me a colouring book, I'll be happy. But if it's got pages with words in it, I'm not a great reader, but I will look up for different things. So she bought a book. And the book was fundamentally about the grace of God. But the grace of God in a practical way, not necessarily in a theological treatise. And it was the story about someone's experience in working with down and outs. And this chap, the author, was writing about a conversation that he'd had with a friend of his who was working with the down and outs. I hope you don't mind me using that phrase, the down and outs in Chicago. Those people who were living on the streets, those people who really were down and out on their luck. And within that community, his friend was saying, this woman came up to him and she was asking him for help. She was asking him for help. And he learned a lot from her during the following conversation. He found out that she was homeless, she was sick in herself, she was unable to feed her 2-year-old daughter. In fact, she rented her 2-year-old daughter out to men so that she could have enough money to pay for her drug habit. This is the sort of person that he was meeting. And he listened to this tragic life story. She listened to this terrible tale. And he said to her, have you ever thought about going to church? Have you ever thought about going to church? This was her reply. This was her reply. Church. Church. Why would I ever go there? I'm already feeling terrible about myself. They just make me feel worse. Well, that's an indictment, isn't it? That's a real statement. Why would I go there? I already feel bad about myself. They're going to make me feel worse. Is that how people view the church? Is that how people in need look at the church, look at Christians? Would such a person be welcome here? If you knew that person and you knew her background and you knew how she lived and you knew what she'd done, would she be welcome here? Does our disgust of her behaviour mean she'd not be welcome here? Are we that disgusted about what she did that she'd not be welcome here? You know, Paul once wrote to the Christians at Corinth and he said, and such were some of you. I love that phrase. It knocks the pomposity out of Christians. He said, that was you once. That's what you were like. And we're just going to say, there but for the grace of God go I, and cross over to the other side of the road. Is that the church in this case? There go, but for the grace of God go I, and we'll cross over the road, as they did for the Samaritan. Does the church still believe in the grace of God? Do we still believe it? Do we know it and talk about it? Do we believe it? When we looked previously at the opening chapter of Mark's Gospel, when we read it through, it was full of undesirables. Full of undesirables. People who lived on the edge of the community. People who lived on the outside of a very unwelcoming community. And even in those days, it was the religious people who wielded the biggest stick of protest to keep them at arm's length. We don't want them inside our community. Push them to the outside. To keep those unwanted people a distance away from us. It's interesting, don't you think? The religious people were the worst. That's not the gospel. That is self-righteous judgment. That has no place in the message. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 3, Paul says, "For if anyone thinks himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself." It's a dangerous thing to put ourselves higher than other people. Do you want me to list for you the people that we think are undesirable today? Would you like me to read you a list of the people that we think are undesirable? People who probably live on the edge of our communities or on the edge of society. We're not really embraced in any way. People you'd least like to see coming through the door this morning. People who'd make you, oh no, he's here. Would you like a list? I'm not going to give you one, but I bet you've got a list in your head. I bet we've all got lists of people or names or places or people that we think, God doesn't have that list. God doesn't have that list. In Revelation 22, we read these words that God says, "Come. Come. And let him who hears say, come. And let him who thirsts, come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely." God has an open door policy. Those in need and know they need, he has an open door policy. Does the church still believe in the grace of God for all people? Or just the nice ones? Just the acceptable ones? You know, we are terrible at judging people's lives. We're terrible at it. I took a break from doing this and I went over to Tesco's. Now, there are other stores available, but I went to Tesco's. And I was standing in Tesco's, putting my stuff on the conveyor belt, and then waiting for it all to move down. And as I was standing there, I do what you all do, and don't deny it. We all look to see what other people had in their baskets. We all look to see what they were putting on the conveyor belt, to see what sort of things they were buying, what sort of things they were eating. And this elderly lady on the conveyor belt next to mine, she's putting her food out, and out of the basket came the biggest bottle of vodka I've ever seen. Huge bottle of vodka. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my word, how old are you and you're drinking that stuff? What is wrong with you? Judging. Judging. That's what we do. We're terrible about making judgments about people, about judging people, how they look, what they're buying, what they wear, what they're doing. We make judgments. And then what we like to do next is pronounce judgments. That's our next one. Now we've judged you, now here's my judgment on you. When people in need come into the church, is that what they find? Is that what they're going to find? A room full of judges? Do we set social limits on the forgiveness of God? Do we set a boundary around those who are acceptable? When those who are seeking God come looking for him in this place, do they find living and audible evidence of the grace of God? Is that what they find when people are looking and searching, those who need? The lady we read about at the beginning, if she went to church, is that what she'd find? She says, no. They're going to make me feel worse. The living and audible evidence of the grace of God should be there. It's what people should find when they come to Kosh, when they go to Hill Park, when they go to Zion, wherever they go where Christians are meeting. It's what they should find. Because those people know the grace of God. They haven't risen up a platform higher than anyone else. That has to be the message that we send to people who walk through that door. People who come and sit in places similar to this. They should meet sinners saved by the grace of God. Nobody better, nobody worse. All sinners. But these ones have been saved by the grace of God. Now, Paul said of himself in 1 Corinthians 15, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. But I laboured more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me." The evidence. I forget which author did. Who did Evidence Demands a Verdict? The book. I forget who it was. What a title. Evidence that Demands a Verdict. Is there enough evidence in this place? Is there enough evidence in my life that demonstrates the grace of God? That shows how good God is? Because actually, if anyone should know about the grace of God, it has to be his people. It has to be them. They have to know. On the day of crucifixion, we all know there were two criminals either side of Jesus. Two criminals. One of the criminals spent his time making fun of Jesus. He just thought, well, I'm in for a penny, in for a pound. Let's just make fun of him. He didn't really care about who he was. The other criminal says, and we read in Luke 23, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? We are about to die," he says. "We're about to stand before Almighty God. Are you not afraid?" And he goes on to say, "And we indeed justly. We deserve to be here," he says. "For we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then the thief stops talking to his mate on the other side, and he talks to the one in the middle. And he says to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Now the criminal knew who he was. He knew who he was. He knew how bad he was. He knew why he was there. He knew he deserved to be there because of the life that he'd led. He accepted that he was suffering for the consequences of his actions in life. He knew it. He says, "We're receiving the due reward of our deeds." And he recognized the state of his life. And he recognized his need of the Saviour that was hanging next to him. So you imagine Jesus responds to this cry. And he says, "Well, okay, let's go through your crimes. Let's see what it is you did. Let's have a look at your life. Let's see how worse I can make you feel than you already do. You're already feeling bad. I'm going to make you feel worse now because I'm going to tell everybody what it is you've done. We're going to go through a long list of all your offences." He couldn't change any of those things. But you know the remarkable thing is that Jesus says in verse 43, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." That is the grace of God. That is the grace of God. I'm not going to list what you've done because you know it. But that's why I'm here. My job and the church's job is not to single people out because of their life choices. My job and the church's job is not to separate people out into acceptable groups. And my job and the church's job is not to be the adjudicator on people's lives. Who's good, who's bad, who we like, who we don't, who's on the right way, who's on... Our job, as we said at the start, is to preach Christ and Him crucified. I have nothing else other than that. It is the only means by which people can be right with God. It is not my job to list the things that you've done in your life that are wrong. But it is my job to tell you of the one who can put those things right. To preach a message where there is hope, where there is light in the darkness. Our job is to point to the one who hopefully one day will say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. To preach Christ, to preach him and him crucified. You remember those words we read in Ephesians 2? For by grace you have been saved, through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. I think that's a powerful verse. So what it says, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you think you can offer. And actually it doesn't even matter what you've done. Salvation comes by the grace of God, where he gives to you something we do not deserve. That is amazing grace. When people are broken and genuinely seeking the living God, is it a message of condemnation or a message of hope that will make the difference? That will make that young lady think, I want to go there. Because there's an answer to my misery. There's an answer to my life. Jesus said in John 10:10, I have come that they may have life and that they have it more abundant. He doesn't say I've come that they may have a miserable life and I make it worse. I've come that they might have life and have it more abundantly. Way more than they expect. In Matthew 11:28 says, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden. And what? I'm going to make it worse for you? No, I will give you rest. This is the grace of God, giving us what we don't deserve. Jesus brings life. He lifts burdens. People who are genuinely seeking God should have their burdens lifted by Christ and not added to by the church. We're not here to make it worse for people. We're here to show them, direct them to the one who will make it better. The one who can lift them. How many people are reluctant to come into places like this? I know how many there are. Because they believe that we're just going to add fuel to the fire of their isolation. We're just going to make life worse for them. By the things that we say, or the way we behave, or the way we act when they come in. Every Christian has known the grace of God. Every single believer has known the grace of God. And people need to know that no matter where they are in this life, they are still precious to God. And his grace can transform their lives. I will say that the starting point for anyone seeking Christ is the same as the man on the cross. To recognize your need of him. To recognize your need of him. To know that you've broken the law of God and that life hasn't got the answer. The one who recognizes that they are a sinner in the sight of God doesn't need to be told how bad they are. Don't need to be told how bad I am, I know. They need to hear about the grace of God. People who are desperately broken need the grace of God. But without believing that we're sinners in the sight of God, if you don't believe that you need Christ, you're not very close to becoming a Christian. Because it's not by works, it's not what we do. It's by his grace. Through faith. So often in the Bible you read about people who came to Jesus. Why? Because they needed him. And they knew they needed him. That's the starting point. The lady we mentioned at the start, she didn't need to be told how bad she was. Nobody needed to put down a list of the things that she was doing. She needed to know that she was loved by God and his grace was all she needed. That was the step she needed to take to go forward. That was the place that she needed to find herself. The journey to forgiveness at Calvary begins when you realize why he was there. Okay? The journey to the grace of God begins when you understand the mercy of God. Forgiveness at Calvary begins when you realize why Christ was there in the first place. Why he was crucified. And the grace of God takes you on with him. By grace, people will be saved. That's what the Bible says. Through faith, and not of ourselves. It's God's gift to give, not yours to demand. Does the church still believe in the grace of God? Do we still believe that to be a truth? That it is about him, not us. Jesus came to lift burdens, to heal, to bring faith. He came to bring the grace of God to a fallen world. God is the instigator of grace, not me. It comes from him. And it's from him that all other graces flow. Ours is not to make those without hope feel more hopeless. That's not the gospel. That isn't what the Word of God says. The gospel is one of hope. The gospel is one of a transforming life, of lifting up out of the darkness into the light. That's the gospel message, not pushing people further down. The sick, the tired, the lost are looking for hope. Don't let the church lock them out. Don't let me as a Christian lock people out. Denying people access to God by me pointing out their failings, their shortcomings. The grace of God is open to all. Okay? The grace of God is open to all. Not to my list. Not to our list. Not to our ideas of who is and who cannot receive the grace of God. Whoever comes in here, they need to find grace in this place. They've got to find grace in this place. Otherwise, we're a religious group meeting. That's it. We just come along and have a sing song and read a few things. The grace of God has to be evident of lives that have been transformed by God. Because that's what people are looking for. They're looking for the same. They're not looking for what they can find on the pub or the social clubs. They're looking for something else. They need to see the grace of God has done a remarkable thing in our lives. And that's what people should be looking for me as well. One of the greatest songs ever written. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. You want to finish it? I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. These words were written by a man named John Newton in 1777. It was a poem to begin with. It was just a poem. And he read this poem at a sermon on the 1st of January 1773. And it wouldn't be till 60 years later that somebody put a tune to it, which is where we are today. But originally it was a poem. This man, John Newton, was born into a Christian home. You think, oh, hey, things are looking good. What a great environment to be born into. He grew up to become a crude, rude, and unpleasant man. He was a deserter. He was a slave trader. He was a man who was hostile to the things of God. And he knew it. He knew he was a bad lot. He knew by the way he lived and behaved and spoke, he was a bad lot. And I would argue that such a man would have been on our list. Such a man would have been on our list of people that we would least like to see walk through that door. He would have been one of those we said, whoop, that John Newton, there but for the grace of God go I. And we cross over to the other side of the road. Grace of God's all right for me, not for him. Our God has no list. He doesn't say, oh, that one's not deserving. No, he's deserving. Oh, that one's deserving. He doesn't have that. Newton goes on to write, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed." Do you know, he said of himself, when his life was changed, "People stare at me." He said, "People stare at me, and well they may. I am a wonder to many. I am a wonder to myself." That's the power of the grace of God. Does the church still believe that that power exists? Or are we barring the room to those who are undesirable? Are we saying there are people out there that God's grace can't change? Is there a group of people out there we don't want to embrace the grace of God because of who they are or how they behave? God says, it's my grace. It's my grace. And I will give it to whom I will give it. Jesus bans no one from coming to him. Come to me, he says. Come to me. Whoever we are, to come to him. It is the greatest message this world can have as it's rapidly falling apart, as it's desperately looking for something, for an answer, for a reason. And there it is, the grace of God. Don't tell people how bad they are. Tell them how good God is. Tell them how good your God is. The hymn says, tell them the old story of unseen things above. Tell them the old story of Jesus and his glory, of Jesus and his love. That's what they need to hear. Tell them about my grace that changes lives. The grace that saved a wretch like me. The grace that saved a wretch like him. The grace that saved a wretch like Mrs. P. The grace of God has done things, and it can still do things. Somebody once said this, that grace is the embrace given by a loving parent to a disobedient child. Did you ever want to hug your child when they've done something terrible? When they've done something really bad? That's grace. To give them a hug when they've done something bad. Grace is Christ the King dying to save the rebels who oppose his rule. It is deserving hell, but getting Jesus. That has to be the core of how Christians live and speak. It has to be the heart of who we are. Fundamental to how the church exists, how Christians live. It is underlying our message all the way through. The grace of God. When Paul wrote to the Romans in chapter 5 verse 10, he said, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." That is remarkable. That our lives can be so transformed in the sight of God because of what Jesus did at Calvary. Jesus doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Jesus doing for us which we did not deserve. That's the grace of God. Do we still believe it as God's people? Do we still believe it as churches? When we think, no, that was just for me when I was a Christian 40 years ago. God's grace changes lives. That's what people need. And it's true to know that once people become Christians, every believer knows that the grace of God doesn't end there. Every single day, God's grace comes pouring out to those who are his. A true understanding of the grace of God leads to a life of gratitude and obedience. Through many dangers, toils and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. God's grace is remarkable. It changes lives today. It transforms lives today, but it gives life for the days that lie ahead. In 2 Corinthians verse 9 we see these words, And God is able to make all grace abound to you, his people, his children, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, and have abundance for every good work. My grace is sufficient for your daily needs. God's grace doesn't end when we believe. Newton's words include these. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. He knew what he was talking about. What makes this one of the greatest hymns ever written is that every single believer can sing it. And they know it to be true. It is a remarkable piece of work. It's an amazing poem. The grace of God is my salvation, and the grace of God will take me through to glory. It's not about me, my strength, my abilities, my cleverness. Not that I have any of that. So when people come in here looking for God, is that what they hear? Is that what they see from us, from his people? Is it our judgment, or is it his grace? What is it people need to hear? If you know in your heart today that life is not how you want it to be, if you know in your heart that the promise the world has made has proven to be false, let me tell you about one who knows where you are. One who knows exactly your heart. The one who can change lives for the better. And his name is Jesus. Do you know what the grace of God says? We read it at the start in Revelation. Come. That's the grace of God. But look at me, look what I'm like. Come. And let him who hears come. And let him who thirsts come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life. What's that little word at the end? Freely. Why? Because my grace is sufficient. It's enough. There are no amendments to that verse. There are no, but not these. There are no, but not you. It is an open invitation for all those who wish to come freely to him. Well, we're going to, surprise, finish with that song. I don't know if you thought it coming, but we're going to finish with that song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, who saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. But as blind, but now I see.